Welcome to this session of Marxism 2022. We've had our warm-up act, Jeremy Corbyn. He's gone now, so we've got the real star of the afternoon, which is Hannah Lowe here, who is a Costa Book Award winner for her fantastic volume of poetry called The Kids. Your third volume, was it, Hannah? Yeah, third volume. And so we're delighted to welcome Hannah to Marxism today. We're going to start with a little chat. Hannah's very kindly agreed to read some of her fantastic poetry. Then we can open it up to the floor for questions, contributions. I can already see a couple of poets here and poetry enthusiasts. Also looking for school students and students, which Hannah writes about so brilliantly. So I'm going to start by asking you, Hannah, how you feel about the reception to the book, any reviews of the book that you found particularly interesting, or generally the response.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Well, the response to the book has been phenomenal, but also totally unexpected. I suppose when I was writing these poems, it's quiet, meditative act of writing, and you really think that poetry sales in a good poetry book sells 500 copies. It's not like fiction. So the fact that this has had such a public platform has been pretty crazy. And I suppose I didn't anticipate it, but I think one of the reasons it's connected with people is because everyone's had an experience of education, and that's what the book is broadly about.
Yeah, we've all been young, some of us more recently than others, but some of the themes that come through, I think, very strongly in Hannah's book are how the legacies of empire continue to shape both education and the lived experience of young people in multicultural cities like London. So was that something that was important for you, Hannah?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, not least because of my own background. My father was Jamaican. He was Afro-Chinese. And when I was a kid at school, and all through my secondary education, we were not taught anything about the British Empire at all. So I had this kind of slightly anecdotal knowledge that my dad had come because of post-war migration, because Jamaica had been a former colony of the empire, but nothing was ever legitimised through education. In fact, I remember when I was a GCSE history student writing an essay about we had to write about someone in our family that had an interesting historical story, and I wrote about my dad growing up in Jamaica under colonialism, and I said that his education was Anglo-centric, as in looking towards Britain, and my history teacher circled Anglo-centric and wrote no such word, which I thought was so interesting, even at the time as a 13-year-old. But fast forward all these years later, when I was a teacher, I became a teacher when I was 21, there was still no teaching of empire going on in schools and colleges. So the sixth form where I taught, it was truly international, like students that might have been second, third generation Caribbean, African, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, but also newly arrived or recently arrived Eastern European young people, as well as white working class kids. And it was like no one really knew, we didn't know anyone, they didn't know, and the teachers didn't necessarily know how everyone had ended up in the classroom together. And that felt, like something that needed to be addressed. But we were addressing it as a department, some of my ex-colleagues are here, we were addressing it as a department, but it wasn't really acknowledged through the formal curriculum.
Yeah. So what's the first poem you're going to read for us today, Hannah?
Well, I guess on that theme, I will read a poem called The Only English Kid. Hang on, I have to look at what page it's on. The poem is about, in the minority at the sixth form where I taught were white English students, and even a smaller minority of them white working class kids. So this poem is about, thanks Judy, one of them. And also the fact that, we used to talk all the time about Britishness or Englishness in the classroom. And when I was first a teacher, it really surprised me that kids that had been born in Hackney, grown up in Hackney or Tottenham, rarely left Hackney or Tottenham, just didn't regard themselves to be British or English in any way and claimed the identity of their parents or grandparents. And so the poem sort of speaks to that idea as well. The only English kid. When the debate got going on Englishness, I'd pity the only English kid, poor Johnny in his spotless Reeboks and blue Fred Perry. He had a voice from history, the no miss, yes miss, no miss, all treacly cockney, rag and bone. And while the others claimed Poland, Ghana, Bulgaria, and shook off England like the wrong team shirt, John brewed his tea exclusively on Holloway Road. So when Asif mourned the George Cross banner swinging freely like a warning from his neighbour's roof, the subway tunnel sprayed in Muslim scum, poor John would sit there quietly, looking guilty for all the awful things he hadn't done.
Yeah, I think we've all met someone like that. I know my son's school had a culture day recently, and everybody was encouraged to come in costumes that reflected their family backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, and who's white British, one of the only kids in the school. And we thought, well, what's he supposed to wear? He ended up wearing a Chelsea kit. So we've all been, sorry, Johnny. So thank you so much, Hannah. And just before we move on, I'd like to ask and invite you to make any questions and contributions, or make any points about Hannah's book, about poetry, about teaching, dare I? Yes, at the front here.
Hi. Sorry, I know everyone says this. I just want to say I really love your writing. I studied it in uni and it was like my favourite thing ever. I have Chick on my desk.
Thank you.
Basically, there's been like a bit of controversy with people using like real kids to recount stories, and do you think poetry helps you keep the anonymity of these kids? As I'm sure you write of them fondly and try to humanise them as much as you can, but obviously when people hear that teachers are writing biographies, people are worried that they're going to come off wrong, especially when they were in their pubescent years, probably not at their best, because I know I was a bit of a nightmare teenager. That's what I wanted to ask about.
Yeah, I wanted to say as well, I thought the book was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Judy, for recommending it to me. And I'm so pleased you read that poem. That was my absolute favourite poem, The Only English Kid. I mean, I think there is controversy, and quite rightly, isn't it? I mean, I'm quite happy to name Kate Clancy, whose writing was absolutely bloody disgusting, actually. Not only was it disgustingly racist, ableist and everything else you can think of, the attack that she put on that Goodreads reviewer trying to get her sacked for actually quoting from her own book, and then you get the establishment, the white establishment, actually piling on to black writers, calling them, I think, what was it, Philip Pullman called them, like ISIS and the Taliban. You can sort of see the level of racism in the publishing industry, and I thought your book was so incredibly sensitive in terms of looking at a multicultural environment and looking at how children feel without exploiting them on any level. And you know, I read some of the Kate Clancy stuff. I was like, how could she possibly think any of that was acceptable, talking about anybody, absolute massive exploitation of children. And I don't care if it was amalgamation of children. To write about human beings in that way is just generally disgusting. So, I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I wondered what you thought about that controversy.
So I think those two questions covered a similar area. So I'm going to invite Hannah to respond to that, and then we'll have another round of questions and contributions and hopefully some more poetry.
Thank you. It was such a strange issue of timing, because I had no idea about Kate Clancy's book. It had passed me by, and then I had no idea that the titles of the book were so similar. But when everything sort of kicked off on Twitter, I had a sort of slight feeling, oh God, like, oh shit, basically. But then I also felt quite strongly that I'd done everything that I could to not write in those problematic ways about those young people. And several things helped me. One, I'm not her. Two, I come from a completely different background. My subjectivity is totally different. But there is a power dynamic when a teacher writes about their students, like without a doubt. And I think that only occurred to me as the book progressed, when I realised that I had more than a few poems, but actually I thought I had a whole collection. So then, because I'd already written a memoir, a kind of family memoir, I had a pretty solid grounding in life writing ethics. So I started to think about all the things I could do to like hide these students' identities, you know, for a start, but also just not to say anything awful about them. I mean, that was the key thing. It was to write from a point of like trying to connect, trying to understand, and from empathy, not sympathy, not exploiting them. One thing I would say about the book, and this is like a technical thing, the book is sonnets, and they're metrical and rhyming. And if you have to write a load of metrical rhyming poems, what you start to do is you start to fabricate. You really start to lie. And so in some ways, the form of the book, I think, sort of protected me from ever going too near, like, the documentary truth. And I had it in my head that none of these kids would be able to recognise themselves. And I hope that stands. And I suppose I had other things in mind, like, I don't know what difference it makes to say that the students I'm writing about, many of them would be in their early 30s and mid-30s now. I'm not sure if it does make a difference, but I felt there was a passing of time that allowed my own memories to be... I mean, my memory's terrible anyway, so I couldn't even tell you the truth about half those scenarios if my life depended on it. So there's lots of disclosure, a lot of anonymising, but still mindful that I may have stepped over a line. I mean, for sure, like, still mindful, still concerned about that, I suppose.
Something to be aware of and to reflect on. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Could we have another poem?
Yes. I'll read... let me read something, slightly, didn't feel light at the time, but I should say that when I became a teacher, I was so young and I didn't have an English degree. I had a degree in American literature, and I deliberately had read outside of the canon. But of course, then I was put in charge of like English A-level students, and we were teaching the canon. So often I was teaching myself things like, certainly Shakespeare plays, but also whole literary movements like the month before, the week before, the night before. And there's just some things like, it's almost like cultural capital. Like I did grow up in a house of books, and reading was definitely encouraged, but I just didn't have some of the knowledge that other people, my colleagues, seem to have. So I'm sure the learned audience here know that the Restoration diarist Samuel Pepys, that his name isn't spelt how it's pronounced, but I did not. And this was at a time when we'd moved, the sixth form had moved sites, we'd moved to Angel, and all of a sudden we started getting, I guess, like slightly more like middle class students. And for me, I was already on shaky ground knowledge-wise, and I had all these very bright, knowledgeable kids, peppies. The posh girls came and took a corner table, all lip gloss and ribbony hair, and each with a fan of starry GCSEs and a summer of youth hostels in Europe behind them, and the future wide open to them like a rainbow parasol, so I thought. It was Restoration comedies, and I was reading the class an essay, and though I'd seen his name, I'd never heard it. Pepys, I said it, Pepys, over and over, until one girl spoke up. "Do you mean Pepys?" she said. Her voice pulled taut as a noose, as if I were the girl and she the teacher. And what could I have said? I read on. Pepys, Pepys, Pepys. Cool as the trickster, ridiculous as the fool. You know, what I actually said in that scenario is so cringeworthy. Is I said, no, that's another restoration diary. Something I hope I wouldn't feel the need to do now. I could say I just don't know, or yeah, I made a mistake.
It's quite subtle, isn't it, the way some of those class distinctions operate in our lives. And I think one of the amazing things about your poetry, Hannah, is we feel we've met those kids. It doesn't matter if it's that individual or not. We've all met those girls with the starry parasols. So back to the floor. I think, Manjit, did you have your hand up? Sorry, am I dropping you in it there? This is Manjit, who organises Poets Against Racism.
No problem with my ego. Right, so don't leave the tent until 6:10. Plug Poets Against Racism right after this show. So get yourself a sandwich. I wanted to talk about schools generally and poetry. I've been asked to come into school after school as Poets Against Racism to talk about identity, culture and sanctuary. And it's led to a brilliant opportunity to talk about refugees. And schools are asking for a whole day to get poets from the outside the schools because they need a bloody break from the health and safety and COVID. And they just say, please, 5 hours, just have them. And it's weird because the children are really searching identity, Englishness, Britishness. And it also feels like, because some schools are going for status of sanctuary, like the two universities in Nottingham, and that means there's a whole opportunity to talk about refugees today and talk about empire, as we're all a nice product of British Empire, thank you very much. And it's nice to make that link. So I was wondering what you thought about the opportunities in schools for poets to come in and talk about how we use poetry to explore empire, identity and where we're going.
Thank you, Manjit. Comrade at the back with the short hair. Manjit, would you mind taking it? Sorry. Audience participation.
Hi. Wow, that's loud. I take English Lit at A-level, and it was actually my English Lit teacher who introduced me to your work. It was a lovely 8 in the morning. Thanks, Joe. But poetry is truly something that I'm really passionate about, and it's such a shame that poetry is so gatekept. And I feel like when people my age and generally think of poetry, they think of the Romantics, and they think of really kind of verbose, hard texts that you can't get into. And then you've got a lot of modern poetry, such as yours. I mean, the poem we were given by you was The Fist, which I loved it. Not to kiss up, but, you know, it was good. And there was a genuine kind of ripple through the classroom of, these are words that we understand, and this is an accent that we speak in, and this is kind of the language of our friends. And it's so wonderful to see that we do Shakespeare next. You know what I mean? Like, it's coming. But I just think the accessibility of poetry is so, so important, because it helps people connect to who they are and who they could be and how they do feel. I just feel like it's such an important part of poetry.
Thank you very much. I've seen some more hands. I'm going to invite Hannah to come in and respond to Manjit and the last point that was made about poetry, because it was something I was going to ask Hannah about anyway, that poetry can be both a bit elitist, but also it kind of connects to rap music and the poetry of the music of the streets and so on. So it's a kind of contradictory phenomenon, really. So how do you respond to those, Hannah?
Yeah, I mean, look, poetry has it has an association with elitism and high culture, but it is changing. I've seen that. I've seen it in the last 20 years since I seriously took it on, that the voices that are coming through now, the contemporary voices, are different. They are more accessible. They speak like your mates and all of that stuff. They write about the experiences that you can relate to, and that's been, the credit for a lot of that lies with programmes like the Complete Works and the Ledbury Critics that have really aimed to kind of like change who can be a poet, so that it's no longer just the kind of stomping ground of essentially white middle class men, which is where the tradition is located. So I think there's hope to the person at the back. I do think there's hope, and it's great to hear that, you know, my poet, you know, that you, at 8 a.m. you encountered rather a violent, drugged up poem. As for Manjit's point about poetry in schools, I mean, it sounds wonderful. I do think teachers are so absolutely stretched in terms of what they have to deliver now that not all of them can make space for that, but it must feel like, because there's an absolute crisis of mental health issues going on in schools and colleges now, and I know from personal experience that poetry kind of saved my life. I mean, I don't say that lightly. When I was dealing with so much kind of grief around my father and confusion around who I was, when I found poetry, and for me it was late, not that, I mean it was in my late 20s, it was the only thing that made sense to me. And so for young people that have just lived through a pandemic and are living in a very problematic society, for young people from multicultural backgrounds, I mean, times are hard. Poetry hopefully can, give them a route in, can be life-saving for them. And I love the idea of finding a sanctuary in poems, because that's definitely where I've found sanctuary in my life as well. Yes.
Would you like to give us another poem? And then I've got and then, but Hannah's going to read a poem first.
I might flip forward and read a poem from the middle section of the book, which is kind of much more about my own education. And the book is dedicated to my A-level English teacher, a guy called John Toolan, who sadly died years ago now. But I'd gone to this very traditional school and not really felt that I fitted in there. And we'd really read very kind of canonical texts. And then I wasn't allowed into the sixth form, actually, is the truth of it. And I got to Barking College, do English A-levels, and met the most radical teachers there. And the first book John Toolan gave to us was For Coloured Girls Who've Considered Suicide. If anyone knows that book, Enter Saki Shange, it's a poem set to dance about Black American women's experiences, and it completely blew my mind. And that's kind of galvanised my passion for literature and for reading. And so when I was teaching, I realised how what the books that we gave to our students, they really mattered. The choices that we made were really important. That said, I could read a poem about For Coloured Girls, but I'm going to read a slightly more like sentimental poem about John. But really it's about having high expectations of young people. Pink Hummingbird. The postcard he sent to you that long wet summer had on one side a pale pink hummingbird, and over leaf his notes on your essay on Faulkner in his usual turquoise ink, the words you imagined written in sunlight on the bed of his book-stuffed flat, and each weighed with care like a love letter, though it was you that wanted him. All summer you waited for September to be back again in the tattered classroom, the tables pushed together, and him at the top, like a doting father or a bridegroom, or like God, if God wore Dr. Martens shoes and a silver sleeper in one ear. Not the God you didn't believe in, but one who believed in you.
And teacher comrades, wouldn't you love to be remembered like that? I'm sure lots of you will be. Talking of which, yes, the comrades there. Thank you.
Thanks. And first of all, I want to make 2 points. I want to respond to Manjit's point, which I think is extremely important, about getting poets into classrooms and into schools. I taught in Islington for 44 years, 28 of them in a very, very tough all-boys so-called comprehensive. And one of the best things we ever did was, as I was head of English, and I managed to get Mike Rosen to come in. And the English corridor was generally mayhem. And Mike, being a brilliant poet and tremendously imaginative and artistic, but not necessarily much of a disciplinarian, would drag me in to keep order while he enthused the kids. And it gave them agency. We published their books. And I think there's a tremendous difference between that then and now. This was in the late 1970s. And I want to talk about now because it's far more difficult. And one of the things I love about Hannah's poetry is that it is immensely honest about the joys of teaching, but also the tremendous contradictions involved in the present day. I have a confession to make. I was a colleague and friend of Hannah's in the English department at the Sixth Form Centre for many, many years, and I, along with everybody else, I am thoroughly amazed and inspired by the poetry that she's written for two reasons. I think that in a strange way, she is giving the students agency by reflecting their own concerns, their own passions, their own daily sort of internal conflicts. I think that all comes out in the poetry. And she's also very honest about the difficulties of teaching. I think that one of my favourite bits in the book, The Art of Teaching, she talks about how the clock in the classroom doesn't seem to be moving forward. The lesson is so boring, it seems to be moving backwards. The number of times that I experienced that as a teacher, and it is very, very important we address that. I mean, as well as being liberators, we are also, if you like, agents of the ideological state repression of children. And sometimes it feels as though that's what we do, as well as enthuse them. But I just want to pay tribute to Hannah and all of the work that she's produced and all the accolades that she has received. It was brilliant to work with her. But I do want to end on a sad note, and it goes back to Manjit's point, that today, that English department that we worked in together for many, many years has been completely dismantled. Everybody, I had a text from one of the teachers yesterday. They had a farewell do for the whole of the department. There is none of them left. And I think that that is a testament to the way in which the pressures imposed by the Tory educational policies have made the work that we did in our schools and in the Sixth Form Centre more and more difficult now to achieve. But it doesn't mean to say we should give up. Obviously, the fight goes on.
Thank you. I can see all the teachers going, no, not in my lessons. My lessons are always singing and dancing, never boring. I'm going to take the comrade over there with the glasses, the comrade here in the hat. Then I'm going to invite Hannah to come back in, and then I'm going to come over here and over there.
Thank you so much. And Hannah, I have to say, when I saw your name on the bill for today, I was absolutely overjoyed. I'm so pleased that so many people have enjoyed your book and your writing, because for me it was really one of the best things that I've read over the last sort of year or so. So pleased to see you here. The recommendation for me actually came from a friend who lives locally. I'm actually from Manor Park, so I think we're from sort of similar patch, who said, oh, you want to grab this book, have a look at the picture on the front of it, and you might recognise a few people who you know. So I wanted to ask actually first of all about that. Why that picture? Why was that the one that you selected to go onto the front? And to sort of link a bit into what people have been saying about, you know, this question of if it's exploitative of young people to write about them and their experiences. Actually, for me, your writing was, I felt for the first time, an example of, I heard myself in what you wrote. You know, the language in particular I thought was incredibly rich reflection of East London, of London, and that was something that I really particularly enjoyed. But the other thing that I really liked about it was the vulnerability. I thought, I don't know if you would share that assessment of it that came through, you know, from yourself. It wasn't that you were putting across that you were sort of looking down on these young people, but you talked yourself about difficult experiences that you had. And there was two poems in particular in the book that sort of, when I was thinking about this point, that sort of sprung out to me. The first was about your first day, I think. That was the impression I got. Maybe it was about something else. Going into a new workplace or a new college. And the other poem that jumped out was the last poem in the book, which was, of course, not really about. It was about a sort of late night outing that you had, and the sort of generosity of your friends. That wasn't about the young people who you were working with at all. It was about something very different. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. The first is about new projects for you. I really want to know what what's next and what you'd like to go and do. I know obviously you're still doing the work around this book, so you're probably perhaps not thinking of the next one yet. But also for those of us who are educators or working with young people, if there are any contemporary poets who you particularly think we should be sharing, I think it's great to hear from poets and writers themselves who they read. Well, who are you enjoying? So just any little tips really for people who we could sort of pass on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the comrade in the hat.
Hi, I'm Pete the Poet, and I'd really like to support what Manjit was saying and others. I teach the values of race and gender equality in primary schools in Jacob Rees-Mogg's constituency in the West Country. I want you to know I do that, yeah. And I'm sponsored by Somerset County Council. They don't know what I do, really, but they provide schools with a subsidy, which is great. It gets me into, I do about 30 schools a year. And I want to say something about teachers being stretched. Of course they are. But they also want to inspire their pupils. So what I do, and I don't want to be like a one-off treat, I don't want to be a break for the teachers and a treat for the children. I want to be part of an ongoing project, okay? So I go in and through interactive storytelling and performance poetry, high-octane performance poetry that delivers essential messages, I model it. And I say to the children, the pupils, this is what you do, this is how you do it. And there's a training aspect as well. So at the end of the day, I say to the teachers, this is how you do it. And I'll come back in 6 weeks' time and see how you've done. And I think that's the way forward.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Hannah to respond to those 3 points and hopefully read us another poem. Then I think we'll have room for, I can see 3 or 4 more hands. But obviously we want to hear a lot from Hannah today as well as from our audience. So over to you, Hannah.
Well, first thanks, Sean, for your reflections on our time teaching together. I learnt a lot from you and from other people. It was the most amazing department, and it is so sad what has happened to that department at the sixth form. But it's interesting, because I think you probably articulated it better than I have thought it, that the role of the teacher is such a complicated one, because you are an instrument of the state. You are basically doing the state's work, and yet you deeply care about those young people, and you want to do. So it's a conflicting role. But I remember sometimes teaching. Teaching some enormously long novel, and it'd be a dreary afternoon. Like 3 p.m., but the clock hadn't moved in an hour, and I'd catch eyes with the students, and you wouldn't be teacher and student, it'd be human to human. And you'd think, what the fuck are we doing? Do we have to do this, And I think I was trying to get some of those thoughts, into the sonnets in the book. But I'm glad you thought that I captured something of the students' own. It's a great privilege to be a teacher, to listen to those young people, the things they've got to say and the trust they put in you, and to try and reflect some of that back in the poems. It's one of the things I try and do. I mean, there's nothing more cringeworthy than when a teacher says, right, now let's study your slang, and puts on the board, multicultural London English, and then they all get to call out, the words that they use that they really don't want you to know or understand. But I did try to put some of those books, probably those words, pretty dated as they now seem, actually, into the poems. And the front cover, I suppose the other thing, so the front cover, when I was writing these poems, so often my memories of being a teacher, or like my experience of being a teacher, was so intricately linked to my experience as being a student. I don't believe we stop our education at 16, 18, 21. I was always learning. I was learning how to be a teacher for the entire time that I was a teacher. I'm still learning how to teach now. I've been doing it for 20 odd years. But there were so many memories of myself as being on the other side of the desk. And so the photograph shows me as a kid with my mates from Barking College on, it's 1994 at the Carnival Against Racism in Brockwell Park. And what happened to me at college was that I met a few students that were in the SWP and were big organisers, and they organised us to go on demos and down to this carnival, and it was really my big political awakening as well as a kind of literary awakening at the time. So I suppose I'm trying to claim myself as one of the kids here, ironically. And then in terms of recommendation, and so the other thing about the book, what I thought might work as a strategy, and it wasn't really a strategy because I think I just write about my own life and experience, and I think my tolerance for personal exposure must be quite high, but it is full of my own vulnerabilities, not just as a teacher but as a person. And I felt if I could put myself on the page like that, then it would help lever what I was doing in terms of writing about the young people as well. I'd recommend any of the kind of the young, well, not young in necessarily age, but young in poetry years, the writers that are coming through now. People they're not necessarily young, but I'm thinking of people like Roger Robinson, Ray Antrobus, who's doing such brilliant work in schools, Rachel Long, a whole group of kind of contemporary British writers from different backgrounds who are writing very exciting stuff. There's a guy called R.G. Manupillai who has a book coming out next year, a Sri Lankan British poet who I think is really, really exciting, so one to watch. I think his book's out in a couple of months. And then lastly, the role of poetry in schools. As much as I don't think it's the breakneck speed at which the curriculum has to be delivered, but also it's about budgets, it's about decisions, of what value is placed on poetry to get poets in, who's going to, make the space in the timetable and pay for poets to come and work in with young people. Because when they do that, what happens is that it opens a key to a box for young people, and they realise that their language is valid, their thoughts are valid, and especially what Manjit said about, was it Manjit? No, it was Sean, about publishing their work, putting not just getting them to write, but then doing something with that writing, doing some kind of output, whether it's a publication or a poster or whatever. It's so important in validating young people's experience. And it sounds like the work you're doing, Pete, is great in schools. Because I think teachers are also, as much as they are, many teachers are feel very perhaps confident in analysing a poem. I wonder how many teachers of English feel confident in themselves writing a poem. I think when teachers are asked to be creative themselves, there can be quite a shutting down, not with all teachers, but with some teachers. And I think empowering teachers to write poetry, as well as to analyse it, as well, is probably a good idea. Yeah. Sorry, I hope I addressed everything.
Would you like to give us another poem?
Yeah, I'm going to read.
We have had a request for you to read Welling.
Yeah, I'll read that.
The poem that goes with the front cover of the, similar to the front cover of the book, and one I'd love to hear too.
Well, I'm sure some of you were there on that demo to shut down the B&P bookshop back in 1993. It was the first political demo I'd ever been on, and we were right at the front when things kicked off. And because my memories, I have strong visual memories of that day, but I suppose what I did to write the poem was go back and look at the news footage, and the newsreader was speaking in a very RP accent, calling the demonstrators violent, and it was so the opposite of my experience. It was the police that were the violent ones. Welling. On the news that night, they called us violent youth. But what I remember is the green cord jacket I was wearing, pulled from a bargain bin that morning, and a busload of us singing our way down south. The yellow placards like a bobbing sea of lollipops, a beautiful man with dreadlocks, studs in his chin, and us on the front line, marching and chanting, until the chanting suddenly stopped. Then one voice shouted, "Police protect the Nazis." The police like a wall of giant flies, their graceful white horses. Then silence, No moment in my life do I remember quieter. Before the charges, the bricks, the screams, 2 boys with gashed heads running together, that animal smell, red smoke, blood on my sleeves.
And I think that poem captures that sense of shock, doesn't it, that you get as a young person when you're confronting police brutality for the first time. So I'm going to call the next 3 contributions, which is my comrade here, the comrade in the blue hat, comrade in the black T-shirt first, then the comrade in the blue hat, and then the comrade in the visor at the back, and the comrade in the green jacket.
I just wanted to come back on what Hannah just said, really, because I think in schools, poetry can be a massive liberator for people and for students. And, just thinking about all the negatives, the national curriculum, all the things that you're forced to do, it's a way to break that down. And, when we're talking about the role of a teacher, yeah, we are doing the state's job in one way, but we also can actually give a space for students to develop themselves. And that is so, so important. I think when you get students to write, and we have poetry week in October, you see something take off because of the effects of the national curriculum. Kids will say to you things like, oh, I don't like poetry, oh, it's boring, or whatever. But when you get a poet in, when you get poems that relate to their lives, you start to see a change. And when they read poetry and when they come out with their own ideas, you start to understand who really is in the room. They are not a list of people, but they are people who are coming with their own feelings and emotions. One of the biggest things that I've seen like that happen is when you take on poetry that deals with LGBT plus issues in LGBT plus History Month, or just whenever you want to do it, because the visibility of students is never there for them. But when you deal with poetry and the teacher is actually presenting something that legitimizes the ideas about your identity, they can start to feel that they can express ideas about their identity, and poetry is a perfect form to celebrate their own identity too. And I've had students come out through poetry that you've dealt with in that way, and that is massively valuable. So when you think about what poetry does, it is in fact something that opens up an area that wouldn't happen otherwise. So when Hannah started off by saying, I think things are changing because of the link to music, to rap, etc., spoken word, I think that's a brilliant future for poetry. And I think that's one of the ways that teachers can use, or one of the things that teachers can use to start to break down all that negativity, that rigidity, that narrowness of all the canon stuff that you're meant to teach, and start to find a way in to make students find themselves, but also to enjoy poetry and want to express themselves.
Thank you. So the comrade in the blue hat will be followed by the comrade in the visor.
Well, first of all, it's dangerous to give me the mic because you might never get it off me. But the couple of questions is, as poems, it's our job both to educate and to entertain. How do we keep the balance between those two, really? And as you can probably see, I'm a disabled person, not a disabled poet. I'm a poet with a disability because I think I can quite well do poetry. But the question is really, people tend to focus on the messenger rather than the message. So how do you ensure, I want to ask you as a woman, how do you ensure that people focus more on what you're saying rather than who is saying it?
For anybody that tries to communicate and raise their attention, interest and enthusiasm for poetry to children, so I just think maybe Benjamin Zephaniah and Talking Turkeys, if just in case anybody's, and I just wonder, a bit cheeky, if we might have a chance to listen to this performance poet a little bit.
After.
I just want to say thank you for
almost exposing the personal of being a teacher. And I think that definitely needs to be more expressed. As a teacher, as an English teacher, the curriculum is so limiting, and there are so few ways for us to find spaces for children to express themselves. I work in a school that seems to be run by like a Tory curriculum, so we only teach white male dead writers. Very few moments for poetry, very few moments for children to express themselves. And I haven't been there long, but we've done a little poetry club, and I've only had girls come to it so far, and they have had moments to talk about their experiences through Rupi Kaur's work. And I know she's become so famous with her work, but she does talk about migration in a way that actually gives a voice to so many children when we work in a diverse school, and I think that's been really powerful. But you personally can't be the only teacher who is expressing your experience. And so my question is, what do you want other teachers to be speaking about, maybe through poetry, but maybe through other means, to really emphasise that teaching is a personal experience, and that it's actually about the children and giving them opportunities to find their voice before they have to go into the world of work and the world that they have to enter into.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for this excellent section. I'm from Chile, and I came here as a refugee, and I would like to sort of give this sort of a real story about a poet and a popular singer and a director called Victor Jara. He wrote his last poem. He was captured by the military dictatorship the second day of the coup. And he wrote his poem before 3 or 4 hours before he was executed. And the military broke his hands before his execution. But in his poem, and he left it on a chair, another comrade took it in his mouth when he was sort of, being released, and then the poem became known worldwide. And it's a poem of denunciation about the ugly feature of counter-revolution. And he described so graphically how the ruling class is so savage against our class that not only he broke his hands, but eventually he was executed and dumped, in the suburb of Santiago. And as a result of the poems, we took it as a weapon of a struggle, as a weapon of denunciation against the atrocity of the ruling class in Chile. And therefore, I think poem, which comes from the heart of people, it can be a weapon of liberation, a weapon of denunciation, and also a weapon of happiness in order to release the insane and confused society that primarily children live in this country. And therefore, I love poem for that reason. It's a very, very complex conjunctions of words and ideas and imagery that goes into your soul and can wake up you in order to fight atrocity, in order to fight racism, in order to fight sexism, and therefore, comrade, I would congratulate you, as a poet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're getting a theme that, despite the constraints of the curriculum, despite the difficulties of breaking through the canon, poetry is retaining its liberatory force in the hands, at the pen of people like Hannah. So Hannah.
Yeah, I love that idea of poems as being like weapons, but not necessarily in a violent way. But there is something, isn't it? It's like that whole idea that it's Percy Shelley, isn't it? Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And I think I've always loved that quote because it's so empowering. It means that people that write, poets can take back power. They can testify to their lived experience. Young people can do that and have their... Yeah, it's like poems that can be dangerous things, and that's why sometimes poets and poems, there is an attempt to kind of quash them because they are so powerful. As to some of the other points, I think I might have lost the thread slightly, but I suppose in terms of like how can the poem being more important than who's written it, I suppose there's one bit of me that the poetry teacher wants to say, make your poems as good as possible, spend hours and hours on them, and somehow they'll cut through, while also knowing that there is still a kind of nepotism that goes on in the poetry world and all of that kind of stuff. That said, there is a kind of democracy to poetry publishing on some levels, where magazines, like I'm editing the Poetry Review at the moment, and people just can submit their poems anonymously or not anonymously, and we'll read them, and if they're good, they'll get published. And I think the spoken word stage is another place for great democracy as well. You know, the open mics and all of that kind of stuff. Even though it sort of gets poo-pooed by the page poets, it's just a ridiculous divide. And then just responding to your comment about teaching and other teachers. I suppose part of the reason I wrote this book is because I think about all the conversations I had in offices and in staff rooms with other teachers about things that had gone well in lessons and sharing them, like it's kind of great camaraderie that does not exist in my university teaching at all, where we just go in like hit and run, teach and then leave. Like it was a completely different job, and I missed that. I really missed the camaraderie. And all the conversations I had with colleagues about what went well, but also the struggles of how to teach things, how to, like, why are we teaching this, like all of that stuff. And then the students that you would have that you couldn't connect with, that you couldn't reach, and like students that just disappeared, especially at sixth form, like the students that we didn't retain. Remember that word, retention? We didn't retain them, like, and it was so kind of like it's such a deeply humane profession and occupation, and I suppose I was trying to capture some of that in the book. And I guess all I can really say is that I hope other teachers feel that they can maybe talk a bit more about the humanity of that profession, whether it's in conversation or through writing. I mean, not all teachers are going to become poets, but teachers can write and should write, and maybe not be afraid to write. I don't know if I've really answered that question well enough, but another poem. Okay, well, let me read. So before risk assessment and health and safety and all of that stuff, hopefully teachers do still take their students to the theatre and on other outings. But we used to get all the cheap tickets at the National or the Barbican, and take big groups of kids to see Shakespeare, to see whatever was on, Duchess of Malfi, and some of those kids used to make me laugh. I remember once saying to them, that some of them had been to the theatre lots, others had never been to the theatre before, I think I said once, you can get food in the interval, like ice cream, but it's expensive, so maybe you want to bring some food with you, some snacks. And then looking down the aisle of a matinee of 12th Night and seeing 30, 40 kids with 2-litre bottles of Fanta and Tupperwares of fried chicken and big bags of Doritos and all that stuff. And it used to make me laugh, the kind of irreverence of that, without knowing that was so out of the theatre tradition. And then once we took about 60 kids to see, I think it was Othello, and my colleague said, this is more like bloody dog walking than teaching. And that's the epigraph for this poem, The Sixth Form Theatre Trip. You've got more dogs than you can count, big dogs and small. One badass dog in headphones mooching up the aisle. A dog who smuggled in a hot dog. 2 loving dogs back row, already smooching. Some dogs are up on haunches, barking. A dog or 2 already dozing, heads in paws, dog sighing and dreaming. The other theatre dogs look down their snouts, a pair of tutting chow-chows, some Sloaney poodles in the box. But when the curtains lift and your dogs are hypnotised, their ears like little hoisted sails, the wag of tails, their shining dog hearts fling wide open. They know these words, these lines, memorised like buried bones. And don't you love your dogs?
So brilliant. Thank you so much. I've got 2 questions that have been submitted online because we are live streaming, and there's time for a couple of questions or comments before we ask Hannah to finish off today. So the first question is, a school in Bristol has developed a module on Somali poetry as part of decolonising the curriculum. Is this an approach you would support? And the second one says, thank you, Hannah, for reading Welling and for the anti-racist themes in your poems and for the wonderful photo on your book. And that's from Roger Green, who's a retired. He says he's an NUT rep, which tells you he's retired because it's the NEU now, but never mind. Thank you, Roger. So would anybody else like to make any last points? Yes, a comrade here in the black T-shirt.
Hi, Hannah. Your book came to me at a perfect time. I'm currently learning how to teach, and the art of teaching really helped. And I passed it around a lot colleagues, and the reception is really positive. I also come from the working class, so I often mispronounce words. You should never mock anyone who mispronounces a word, because it means they've read it.
Yeah.
I'd just like to stand, and similar story, I had a teacher that kind of gave me the love of literature, and the books they gave me have kind of stuck with me till today. So I found a lot of echoes in what you're doing. But my question is about form. The book's sonnets, so I'd like to know how your relationship to the sonnet has developed as a result of writing this book.
Okay. Thank you. And the comrade in the black hat with a UFO, is that a UFO logo? If you just wait for the microphone, just so we can all hear. Thank you.
Oh, right. So just 2 brief questions. First of all, is poetry a force that can change the world? And do you recommend self-publishing?
So is poetry a force that can change the world? And does Hannah recommend self-publishing? Any other points? Sorry, you've been kept busy rushing around. The comrade in the sunglasses at the back.
I just wonder how we can break the tyranny of the English teachers here. It's just getting on my nerves. Too much. How can we make poetry live in other subjects? So make it a cross-curricular subject. I'm wearing this Care for Kelly T-shirt here, and often use that who puts their child in the water unless the water is safer than the land poem. But how can we break through so poetry isn't just the preserve of English teachers?
Challenge to the science and maths teachers here. Any more? Yes, comrade there in the green T-shirt.
Just very briefly, as a sociology teacher, retired many, many years, but now as a book group reader, we had your book as our book to read with a group who were not, some were teachers and some not, and we absolutely loved it. And I think that's an area that could be developed, that people who had nothing to do with education but just with life loved the poems, and lots of them spoke to them, and we all chose our favourites, and then we just kept reading more and more, and we just had a fantastic evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you, that's lovely. So if there's no more pressing, it's like an auction, be careful where you put your hand. Yes, comrade in the middle here in the brown jacket. Probably be the last contribution, and then I'm going to ask Hannah to respond and give us a couple more poems to finish off the session.
Thank you for sharing your poetry. My question is, what advice could you give to someone who's trying to find confidence in their voice, but also suffers with being too vulnerable and expressing their deepest sentiments in the artwork that they create? Because I feel like when you do that sometimes, there's the risk of you exposing yourself to malicious people in the world, I guess. People who might judge you for expressing what's on your mind. So what advice do you give to writers?
Thank you very much. And that's another theme that's come out in a few questions, isn't it? That question of making yourself vulnerable and speaking the truth, the inner truth, and so on. So over to you, Hannah.
Well, first of all, to the person on Zoom asking about Somali poetry, I think, yes, that sounds like a great thing to do. I mean, you know, like there is such a rich world out there of poetry from different cultures and different places, and poems, you know, the art translation in itself is the most amazing art form, and presuming that you're going to be reading these poems in translation, they're in Bristol. So, yes, like thumbs up to that. Someone else asked about the sonnet. So, and this might slightly speak to your question as well about exposure. Form, if you are interested in it, and not everyone is. Like most contemporary poets are writing in free verse. But for me, poetic form, it isn't just like, oh, isn't it clever? I can rhyme and like write a sonnet. It's actually about where it takes your imagination. Someone said, George Surtees says, the constraints of form are the chief liberators of the imagination. So when you have to rhyme metrically and all of that stuff, your imagination goes to somewhere new, and it can be incredibly rewarding. And that's why I wrote the book as sonnets. For me, like writing in free verse, it's like diving into an ocean. Whereas I like a swimming pool with rules and a lifeguard, and that's what the sonnet is. But it was also sort of political, because I could, like, you know, what is the kind of, you know, if you had to kind of name the pinnacle of high literary form, it's the sonnet, right? Because of its traditions with Shakespeare and all of that. And I started sketching these poems out, and then I could see that the writing in the sonnet was a sort of political act as well, to write about my experience and these kids' experience in that form. But it was also mimetic, because I began to see that the shape of the poems on the page, you know, it looked a little bit like a classroom, looked a little bit like a blackboard or a page in a book. And so many of the poems are about classroom encounters. So then I also tried to write these I began trying to write this book as interlinked sonnets, where the last line of the first one is the first line of the next. It's called you write 7 of them, and it's called a crown. 15's a heroic crown. I think I got to 35 before I realised it didn't work. It really didn't work. It was very painful. But I'd done a lot of the scaffolding. So the more you write in a form, choose a form and stick with it, I guess your fluency increases. So the person that's asking about exposure, find really good metaphor. Don't come at it head on. Hide behind conceit, behind metaphor, so that people know what you're talking about, but they don't know exactly that it's you. And you don't feel exposed. You're hiding behind a clever extended metaphor or something. That's one way to feel like you're protected in some ways. The other way is to not give a shit. You know, somewhere in between them is probably keep writing. Poems are, you know, occasionally you get a poem that falls into your lap like a fallen star, but mainly they are hard wrought. It's incredibly labour intensive. Just because they're short, they are not quick. And so just keep going. And if something feels too exposing, don't do anything with it, but wait until you might feel like you can do something with it. Does that make sense? Yeah, like you don't have to do anything with the poems you write until you're ready to do something. So the person that was asking me about a new book that I didn't respond to, I am writing, but what I'm writing feels very exposing, so I'm holding back and waiting until I feel either that it's not that exposing, I don't care anymore, or I decide to write something else. Yeah.
So, a last couple of poems.
Yeah,
is all we have time for, sadly, but we'd love to hear some more.
Okay. Well, I'll go to the kind of final section of the book. So when I was teaching in Islington, I was living in Brixton, so I very rarely saw the kids that I taught outside of teaching hours. But now I live in North London, And I do see them, except they're all like 35. And I'm like, I know you. But, you know, they're not all 30, some of them in their 20s. But it's a very weird experience seeing kids you taught 15 years ago. So I'll read a couple of poems about that. In H&M, I've seen her 50 times tidying the earrings or punching the till. The same long rainbow hair she had at school. Then one time, as I'm paying, I say, I used to teach you, remember? She stares, then frowns, looks down at her hands, smoothing a fold. It's Hannah. She says nothing, except her look's not happy, more scared. I wasn't very good. She holds out my shopping bag. I can't do books. I'm in there often. The store's around the corner. I see her wheeling clothes rails, making piles of jumpers, colour ordered, red, gold, brown. She's diligent and funny. People like her, I can tell. Sometimes I wave or smile. Then the shutters of her face come down. Actually, no, I'll finish with the last poem in the book, which isn't really about teaching in schools or sixth forms, but it is about, you know, lifelong learning, which is something that I feel so deeply committed to. Like at the minute, I'm doing life drawing classes, and I'm so bad. I'm just so bad, and I'm trying to get better at yoga. And I've got an allotment, and my neighbour, who's is a really good gardener, is trying to teach me about growing seeds. And it's just great to be a beginner at something, and it's great to be kind of crap at something as well. So this poem is about, it's written for my mentor, someone that mentored me for many years in poetry, Mimi Kalvati, but it's really about poetry and yoga. Kathy, Carla. The body is something like a poem, I guess, as I watch my yoga teacher, Kathy, on the back row mat of Carla's yoga class. Kathy can do King Pigeon, the crow, full monkey. Yet here she is in a simple forward bend while Carla lays her palms around her core to push her deeper. Can every pose be deepened, I wonder? Can what's been mastered be mastered more? A poem is something like a body, I guess, when I'm holding somebody else's poem in this sun-filled room they've called a masterclass. But I'm not a master, just a pair of palms which push or pull or loosen someone's lines. I still need kind and guiding hands on mine.